Hello students, welcome to Narayana IAS. I'm Pratik, your presenter for Daily News Analysis. Now students, as like always, we bring before you 5 important articles and editorials from the Hindu and the Indian Express. Students, I'm pretty sure that if you're consistent with referring to our daily news analysis videos within a span of time, you'll be confident about clearing the examination, you'll be confident about having thorough knowledge about various topics, right? So let's get started with 5 important topics. The first topic to be discussed is whether the state government should be allowed to borrow more from the central government, or let's say from the market, to meet the demands of the states, right? The second article talks about the urban poor. The article talks about the employment and the income trends as well as the challenges that the urban poor are facing. The third article to be discussed is the petition filed by a few petitioners before the Supreme Court requesting the Supreme Court to verify all the votes counted in the EVMs by the VVPAT, right? The fourth topic, students, to be discussed is with respect to surrogacy. So what do you mean by surrogacy? The laws related to surrogacy, the issues related to surrogacy, and the overall trend with respect to surrogacy laws, right? And so the fifth topic talks about the India's focus should be on per capita GDP rather than the overall aggregate GDP. So the article talks that if India wants to truly grow as a developed country, then India should focus on per capita GDP. So these are the 5 topics, students, that we shall be discussing in it. Last, students, we are going to discuss some practice questions so that you have thorough understanding of the type of questions that can be asked in the examinations. So students, let's get started. So students, let's start with the first topic. The title of the first topic is, should the state governments borrow more? Right? Now, why is this topic important? For example, it is important to understand the financial relation between the union and the states, right? In this context, we also need to understand what is Article 293, right? Now, students, this particular topic falls under GS Paper 2. In GS Paper 2, we have the topic or subtopic in the name issues and challenges pertaining to the federal structure, devolution of powers and finances, right? Though this topic talks about economy, but it overall emphasizes on the governance, on the relation between the center and the states, not only in the executive and the legislative sphere, but also the financial sphere. But this article emphasizes more on the financial sphere, right? So again, a question can be asked of this nature. For example, this question talks about the fiscal responsibility and budget management. Right? So fiscal responsibility and budget management. So now this article or this question pertains to the economy as a subject, right? So be ready to get such type of questions in your examination. So let us start with the context of the topic that we are to discuss. Now, the context is the financial relationship between the union and the states has sparked debate. Why? Because the Kerala government has accused the central government of interfering in the expenditure of the state government. Now, students, before we understand the various dimensions of this particular topic, let us try to understand the central theme surrounding this particular topic. A basic understanding of this topic. Now, students, we all know that in India, we have the national government, we have the state governments, we have the local governments. Now, these 3 tiers of government, they need finances, they need funds to spend for the overall development of their region, or let's say states. When it comes to the state governments or the local governments, the state governments have to borrow the money from the central government, or let's say from the market forces, right? Now, the Kerala government is accusing that the central government is not discharging the funds to the state government or governments, due to which the state governments are not able to expenditure, or the state governments are not able to spend money for the growth of the state or on infrastructural needs. So this is the premise of the topic. Okay. Now, what's the background of the issue? Now, the Kerala state has filed a suit challenging the center's decision to limit its borrowing. which means the central government has put a restriction on the borrowing limit of the state government. The Supreme Court has referred this suit to a constitution bench, which means now the Supreme Court has referred this matter to the constitution bench, which means constitution bench is a bench consisting of 5 judges. Right? Now, the issue arises amidst a formula for revenue distribution. Now, what is the formula of revenue distribution? Now, as we discussed that, so the central government imposes taxes, different types of taxes, and of the revenue that the central government generates, that amount or a part of the revenues distributed among the states. Right? Now, in such case, the formula for revenue distribution states that how much funds should the central government give it to the different states. But since the Kerala government accuses that the states which are performing well are being penalized, so seen as penalizing states with better social infrastructure. For example, Kerala as a state has better social infrastructure. What is penalizing states? Which means, students, for every 1 rupee that the state contributes to the center's account, the central government only discharges or gives 0.3 paisa to the southern states. Alright. While as on the other hand, the North Indian states, if they are contributing 1 rupee to the center's exchequer, they get more than 1 rupee. That is, for example, Bihar, for every 1 rupee they contribute to the center's exchequer, they get 7 rupees. But the South Indian states, for every rupee they contribute, they just get 0.3 or 0.4 paisa. So the Kerala government accuses the central government of discriminating or in a way penalizing the states that are performing better. Alright. Now, Kerala, known for its social advancement, faces this challenge. Right? They contribute more, but they're getting less. So, with the introduction of the GST, now before the introduction of a GST, that is goods and service tax, twins, the state governments had the power to levy taxes on different types of indirect taxes. But with the coming of GST, right, many of the taxes have been subsumed under the GST, which means the state governments had the power to impose taxes on different subjects, but now with the coming of GST, they cannot do it. So, which means by and large, what we understand is that the state governments do not have funds to spend, especially the Kerala government is accusing that they do not have funds to spend for the capital expenditure. Now, scope of the issue, the case involves a constitutional question. It is not only about the fiscal mismanagement accusations. For example, the central government has accused the state government, Kerala, of fiscal mismanagement. But the article talks of the broader issue of the fiscal autonomy of states. Now, India, under the federal structure, the states are independent entity. The legal basis is Article 293. Now, Article 293 of the Indian Constitution empowers the state to borrow money within limits set by the state legislature, which means the state governments can borrow the funds, money from the union government. The union government can also impose conditions on state borrowings with its consent, but can't regulate all state loans, right? The central government has got the power to limit the borrowing, but that has to be done with the concurrence of the state government, but the central government cannot regulate all state loans. This is what the Kerala government is accusing. Important to note is Article 293 and the constitutional question relating to the fiscal autonomy of the states. Now, which are the challenges raised by Kerala? Now, Kerala contests that the union government's decision to include borrowings by state-owned enterprises and liabilities in its net borrowing ceiling. Now, students, these state-owned enterprises are the enterprises that the state government owns. Now, the state enterprises, of the amount that they borrow from different sources, the borrowing is not a part or is not tied with the net borrowing ceiling. What is net borrowing ceiling? There is a ceiling up to which every state governments can borrow funds from the central government. Now, the funds that the state-owned enterprises raise is not a part of the net borrowing ceiling. But the union government has taken a decision by tying the borrowings by the state-owned enterprises in or with the net borrowing ceiling. This is what the Kerala government is against. This is what the Kerala government is against. Now, the net borrowing ceiling is set at 3% of the projected state GDP. So, the net borrowing ceiling is 3% of the state's GDP. Now, the funds that the state government or the state-owned enterprises raises from the union government or from different sources is tied with the net borrowing ceiling. So this is what the decision that the central government had taken, which the Kerala government is against, which means the Kerala government wants that the funds that the state-owned enterprises raise should not be a part of the net borrowing ceiling, so that the states get more space to borrow funds from the union governments. Now, what are the overall challenges? We know that the union government's power to raise taxes. State governments bear the brunt, especially on sectors impacting daily lives like health and education. Now, because of dearth of funds, because of lack of funds, the state governments are unable to spend money which impacts daily lives such as health and education. For example, in the year 2022 and 2023, the state governments outspend the union government significantly in social services. Now, here, the state governments have spent exceedingly more than what the union government spends in critical sectors, in key sectors like health and education. The state spending, particularly on the developmental areas like social services, has increased notably over 2 decades, which means here this point emphasizes that the state governments are spending more than the union governments. So when the state governments are spending more than the union governments, the state government should get funds so that they can invest in the productive sectors of our economy. So the state spending now, because of the state's overall funding in the developmental sectors, this has helped to alleviate or reduce the national livelihood crisis, or to say poverty. Now, Kerala's historical commitment to Kerala again is one of the developed states. A substantial portion of Kerala's budget is allocated to the local self-governments. As we discussed, there are 3 tiers of government: the national government, state government, and the local self-government. In majority of the states, the local self-governments are not performing up to its mark or up to the expectations that the constitution had expected from the local governments. Why? Because the state government tries to interfere, or the state government obstructs the funds to the local self-government. But the Kerala government has done a good job with respect to devolution of funds to the local self-government. And as the Kerala government is abiding by the constitutional mandate and devolving funds to the local self-governments, the Kerala government does not have money or is lacking in funds, and that's the reason the Kerala government is not able to spend on the capital infrastructure or capital expenditure for the infrastructure development. Now, what is the union government's position? The union government, the central government, states that regulating state borrowing is essential for national fiscal health. For the overall economy of the country, the union government states that it is important that the state borrowing has to be regulated. The union government states that such regulation aims to prevent off-budget borrowing. Now, what is off-budget borrowing? Now, whatever funds the state government, whatever expenditure the state government wants to spend is a part of the budget, right? For example, budget is a account of the revenue and expenditure. So whatever the state government wants to, or for that matter, the central government wants to spend in a year is mentioned in the budget, right? But the state governments, likewise the union government, they also spend money which is not mentioned in the budget. This is known as off-budget borrowings. The expenditure which is not mentioned in the budget is known as off-budget borrowing, right? So the central government states that such regulation is done so as to prevent the off-budget borrowing, right? That could bypass the borrowing ceiling. As we discussed that every state government has a borrowing ceiling, right? So off-budget borrowing, by resorting to off-budget borrowings, the state governments tend to bypass the borrowing ceilings. Now, the union government states that it is in order to prevent such off-budget borrowing, they have regulated the state government's borrowings. The union claims unlimited state borrowing could increase borrowing costs. Now, the union government also contends that if the state government is spending more than what it earns, than what revenue it generates, then this can lead to rising borrowing costs, which means it can lead to inflation. It can lead to inflation, and it can also lead to the private sector moving out of the state, which means that investments would also take a beating. The Supreme Court states that, or the Supreme Court had held that it will determine the extent of the center's control over the state borrowing limits. which means that the Supreme Court is going to analyze the extent to which the central government can regulate the state borrowing. The court needs to balance fiscal discipline with maintaining federal norms and state autonomy, right? The Supreme Court has two tasks. One is to take care of the overall national economy. At the same time, the rights of the state governments, that is the fiscal autonomy of states, because this is a constitutional question. So in conclusion, students, this is a complex issue. Now, it is very important that the central government and the state governments have to coordinate. Now, the question has raised, or the question has been posed by the Kerala government. Why? Because in Kerala government, the party which is in power is not the same that the central government, or that is in the central government. That's the reason we have different political parties running the governments in the center and in the states. That's the reason, because of the differences between different political party, it is leading to such questions being raised, right? So it is important that the collaboration between the union and the state government is important, so that the overall national economy can also be kept into consideration, can be taken care of. At the same time, it is also important to ensure the fiscal autonomy of the states, right? So that overall our country grows and develops. I hope, students, you have understood the essence of this particular article. Students, the second topic to discuss is a topic on urban poor or urban poverty. Now, students, recently India Employment Report was released. Now, this employment report talks about the employment and the income of the people living in the urban centers, right? And again, students, this topic is important from GS paper 1's perspective. In GS paper 1, we have a subject in the name Indian society, and in Indian society, you have this subtopic called poverty and developmental issues, urbanization, their problems and remedies. So we are going to discuss urbanization as a phenomena, their problems and the solution, right? Now, students, again, there can be a question of this nature. For example, the question asks about the role of United Nations Habitat in the United Nations program working towards a better urban future, right? So be ready to face such kind of questions. Now, let's start with the context of the article. Now, students, recently, India Employment Report 2024 was released by two institutions. One is the Institute for Human Development and the second is ILO, that is International Labour Organization. Again, this point is important for your prelims. Now, students, this report talks about the employment and the income levels of people who are working in the urban centers, right? What kind of employment they are employed into, the income levels of the people who are working in the skilled workforce, unskilled workforce, etc. Now, again, the overview of the findings of the Indian Employment Report. Now, this report states that there has been 5.4% average real economic growth from 2015 onwards to 2020-23. But the report also highlights the divergence, the difference in employment and income trends between the people who are working in the rural areas and the urban areas. The report also indicates how higher unemployment rates exist in the urban areas despite higher average monthly earnings. Now, here you get to see that the monthly earnings is on the higher side. But again, we also have at the same time higher employment rate, which indicates that there is a rising inequality between the rich and the poor. Isn't it so? So, the rural-urban migration trends. Now, again, this particular subtopic highlights the fact that there is a migration from the rural areas to urban areas, but the rate among the males has decreased. At the same time, the people who migrate from the rural areas to urban areas, they live in the slum areas rather than the proper settlements. Why? Because they cannot afford to live in a proper settlement, and that's the reason these people live in the slums. Occupation. Now, what kind of occupations do the people who live in the slums are into? For example, it's mostly related to unskilled laborers, which means the share of skilled and semi-skilled labor and employment in the private organization has increased, which means that there has been an increase in these small businesses, small shops, for example, let's say a fruit vendor shop, right? The truck driving, cleaning and construction work. So you get to see the share of people who are working in this petty businesses go up or it is increasing. Income trends, the average monthly income has decreased by 5%, right? The income is highest for the government employees but decrease over time, right? There's also decline in the real income observed across various occupations, and there's also increase in the engagement with petty businesses and construction work. Now, students, the reports of Indian Employment Report, you don't have to mug up all the sets, but you need to have a general understanding of the employment condition in our country. Knowing 1 to 2 facts so that you can mention in your mains examination is more than sufficient. The gender composition, again, there's a decline in the women's workforce participation in the slums, which means again the participation of the women is declining. There's a rise in casual work, that is small business. So this is what the Indian employment rate to highlight. Now again, to sum up, we can say that this article highlights a complex dynamics between the employment and the income of the people living in the urban centers, which means when understanding the report, understanding what the report says, tells that the government should invest significantly in the people who are working in the urban centers or people who are living in the slum regions, right? The government has to support these people so that these people can live a healthy lifestyle, right? But students, as this topic or this report talks about the urban poverty, right? So it is also important to understand the issues or the challenges behind the urban poverty. First, let us try to understand the causes of urban poverty. The first and foremost is the rural-urban migration. Now, students, the report also indicated that there's a trend of the rural people who are migrating to the urban areas or urban centers. Now, students, these people, as we discussed, they live in the slums because they can afford to live in a formal settlement. Now, this migration from rural areas into urban areas, now see, the ones who are unskilled are the ones who basically migrate to the urban centers. Why? Because the urban centers has a pull factor. The urban center has many job opportunities. It can sort of promise a better lifestyle. That's the reason people migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas. Then the skills gap, again, the other reason for the urban poverty. Now, students, the people who are poor, the people who are unskilled, the people who do not have access to education are the ones who do not have skills. Now, students, the people who do not have skills, they do not find employment in the formal sector, right? These days it is very important to be skilled because there's a need for the skilled labor force. Now, that's the reason it is very important for the government to invest in education. Now, it is because of the skills gap, the poor people who are not able to meet the requirement of skills, these people do not get opportunities in the formal sector, and that's the reason it leads to urban poverty. Indebtedness. Now, students, unemployment. What is unemployment? Unemployment, which means people who are ready to work but are not able to find a job. Or let's say underdevelopment. Unemployment and underdevelopment are two different things. Unemployment, people who want to work but are not able to find job. Underdevelopment is a condition where there's limited urbanization. The economic opportunities are not that much the economic opportunities do not exist. The people might be skilled, but because of limited urbanization, because of the poor economic condition of the state, the people are not able to find jobs, right? So, if people are not able to find jobs, they borrow the money from the money lenders. Now, as these people are not in a position to return the amount, it leads to indebtedness, which ultimately leads to urban poverty. For example, let's say if a member of a family falls ill, the bread earner of the family has to borrow money, right? And this leads to indebtedness. This pushes a person into the vortex of indebtedness, leading to urban poverty. Then inflation. Now, the income that the urban poor generate is not sufficient to meet the soaring prices or rising prices of the essential commodities, which means the income that they generate is not in commensurate with the soaring prices or increasing prices of the essential commodities. And that's the reason the savings drop down, which leads to urban poverty. So these are the causes of urban poverty. Now, what are the challenges faced by the urban poor? What is it that the urban poor are not able to change their living condition or change their economic status? Overcrowding. Now, you get to see that because of the cities developing at a brisk pace, many people from the rural areas are coming to the urban area. This leads to overcrowding, right? So, there's number of people who are migrating to the urban centers. Now, urban centers has its own limitations. It is not in a position to absorb the number of people who are flowing into from the rural areas. This leads to overcrowding. Water and sanitation. As or because of overcrowding, students, the urban poor, the people who live in slums do not have the access to water and sanitation. They do not even have access to healthcare. For example, let's say when due to rains or because of rains or in the rainy season, right? The urban slums are the breeding grounds for many diseases. The poor people, because of the poverty, these people are not able to have a proper healthcare, access to healthcare. This leads to poverty, right? So again, they do not have access to the basic or minimal resources, minimal necessities that helps them to live a dignified lifestyle or living condition. Education. Now, if a person has to change his economic condition, situation, the economic status of family, education is very important because education empowers you. Education instills skills in you. Now, this skills is very, very important to change the fortune, not only of you, but also your family. That's the reason access to education is very, very important. But again, because of lack of access to education, the poor people are not able to transform their journey or transform their living style. Again, at the same time, the poor people or the children who are sent to schools have to be or are forced to drop out. Why? Because they have to help their family. That's the reason lack of education is not helping the people, or because of lack of education, they are not able to transform their lives. And last is risk of forced eviction. Now you get to see in the paper or read in the newspaper that at times the government starts on a demolition drive and evicts the people who live in the slums. Now, the people who come from the rural areas, they occupy places which are usually uninhabited, or they occupy the government lands. They live on the government lands. They create the shelter, the slums, the kacha ghar or kacha house, and start living on a place which is usually owned by the government or which is not used by anyone. But on one fine day, if the government thinks that the place has to be used, the government forces these people to evict. Now, these people have nowhere to go to, and this leads to urban poverty, and this is one of the many challenges that the urban poor people face. So, how do we rectify it? How do we ensure that the people who are living in the urban centers or in the slums, their lives get transformed? One is to enhance the social security, which means the state government has to help these people. For example, we have Manrega scheme for the people who live in the rural areas. We can have such similar scheme in the urban centers so that we ensure that the people who are living in the urban centers get meaningful employment, get a decent earning so that they can sustain their livelihood. Improved access to basic services like health, sanitation, etc. Education. Because having access to health, sanitation and education can help the poor people to transform their living style. Community engagement activities. For example, we can have special campaigns. Dedicated in the urban slums or in the urban poor regions, wherein these schemes or these campaigns would help the people to understand about the social welfare programs introduced by the government. For example, let's say in the insurance sector, in the banking sector, etc. Right? Then establishing local self-help groups. Now, it is very important to establish local self-help groups in the urban slums, because such self-help groups will allow to facilitate credit to the poor people so that the livelihood diversification can take place, right? So this can also lead to meaningful generation of employment. Migration support services. Now you need to have migration support services so as to enable or so as to facilitate smoothless migration from rural to urban centers, and then focus on minimum wage enforcement, which means that students, unfortunately, in India, the labor standards are not followed. Now, the people who work or work for 15, 16 hours are not paid or not given wages in commensurate with the hard work they are. So they are being exploited. The poor people are being exploited. Why? Because they do not have the awareness of the laws or the provisions meant for the facilitation or betterment of these people. Right? So that's the reason labor laws should be strictly adhered to. For example, the government of India has come up with various schemes like Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. Then we have Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation, Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana, Jal Jeevan Mission Urban. Then we have Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, and we have PM Awas Yojana. So these are some of the schemes that the government of India has introduced to address the challenges that the urban people are or urban poor are facing. So these examples you can mention in your mains answer, right? So I hope students you have understood the challenges that the people who live in the urban areas are facing, right? Students, the next topic that we shall be discussing is the petitions filed before the Supreme Court requesting the Supreme Court to give an direction or order to the Election Commission of India stating that every vote casted in the electronic voting machines should be verified through VVPAT. So what exactly is this issue? Let's try to understand it. Before, let's try to understand the importance or relevance of this particular topic for UPSC examination. So you need to know what is EVM, then you need to know what is VVPAT slip, Election Commission of India. And again, this topic is important under GS paper 2. We have the Representation of People's Act, right? So let's get started. Again, a question can be asked of this nature. For example, in light of recent controversy regarding the EVMs, what are the challenges before the Election Commission of India, right? So let us try to understand. So first of all, let us try to understand, students, what is EVM, what is VVPAT, and then we can understand the exact nature of issue that is currently before the Supreme Court. Now, students, whenever you go to cast your votes, I have no idea how many of you are eligible to cast your votes, but for all those who have casted your votes, when you go to cast your vote, there's a machine called electronic voting machine, right? Now, on the electronic voting machine, you get to see the name of the political party and the symbol of that political party. And against it, beside the name and the symbol of the political party, there's a button wherein you can press the button, right? So there are the list of political parties and the symbol. Now, when you go to cast your vote, you look at the political party, the symbol of the political party, and against it, there's a button. You press that button to cast your vote, to the political party that you want to vote for. So once you cast your vote on the electronic voting machine, there's another system which is located besides the EVM, which is known as VVPAT. VVPAT stands for Voter Verifiable Paper Audit Trail. Now, in order to confirm that the vote casted by you is correct or incorrect, there's a slip. There's a slip that appears on the screen of the VVPAT. So on the screen, you get to see the political party, name of the political party, and the symbol that you voted for. This is for the sake of confirmation that if your vote has been casted accurately or correctly. So the flash on the screen is visible only for 7 seconds. Within 7 seconds, you need to see the screen and confirm or ensure that the vote that you casted the EVM is appearing on the VVPAT system, right? This is to ensure that there is no manipulation or there is no tinkering done with the electronic voting machine. This is the system. Now, the current practice is that in one assembly constituency, only 5 polling booths are selected and the votes casted in the EVMs are matched with the VVPAT slips. So, let's say, for example, in an assembly constituency, there are, let's say, 20 polling booths, right? Now, the votes cast in the EVMs are not cross-verified in all the polling booths. Only 5 booths are selected, 5 polling booths are selected, and in those 5 booths, the votes casted in the EVMs are matched or cross-verified using the VVPAT slips. Now, some petitioners or few people have requested the Supreme Court that the votes casted in the EVMs, right, should be cross-verified with all the slips. For example, if there are 20 polling booths in one constituency, which means the votes casted in the EVM should be cross-verified in all the 20 booths. This is a request before the Supreme Court. I hope you understood the exact nature of question which is before the Supreme Court. So this is a current practice where only votes in 5 polling stations per assembly constituency are verified through VVPAT slips. So what is VVPAT and EVM? We have discussed it. So what is the issue? The petitions argue that the complete transparency in the election process by counting all VVPAT slips, enhancing the credibility. So in order to ensure transparency, the petitioners want that all the votes casted in the EVM should be cross-verified. But the Election Commission of India stated that it is not possible to cross-verify each and every vote casted in the EVM machine. Why? Because of the logistical and practical consideration in the electoral management. It is going to be a time-consuming process. Now again, with respect to this topic, you need to know, or you need to be abreast with the judicial precedent, that is the Subramaniam Swamy versus Election Commission of India case of 2013, wherein the Supreme Court held that the VVPAT is indispensable, very, very important for the free and fair election. In accordance with that, the Supreme Court has directed the Election Commission of India to equip the EVMs with the VVPAT system. Right? So this is the case, judicial case that you need to know. I hope students you understood this particular topic. Now students, the next topic to be discussed is the law relating to surrogacy in India, right? Surrogacy laws. Important. Why? Because you need to understand the surrogacy rules, and again this falls under GS paper 2, that is under government policies and intervention and the effect of the government policies. So again, a question can be asked with respect to the challenges that women in India face. Now, the central government, what is the context of the topic? The central government has brought changes in the Surrogacy Regulation Act of 2021. Now, because of the changes in the Act, it is resulting in the Indians traveling abroad for surrogacy. So, let's try to understand few dimensions associated with this topic. Now, what is surrogacy? Now, students, let's say when a couple is not able to conceive or unable to produce or give birth to a child, what they do is they hire a surrogate mother, a surrogate person, which means this mother or this lady agrees to raise child on behalf of the couple. Now, how does she do so? She either uses her own eggs or the eggs of a donor mother, right? And this eggs are then fertilized with the sperm of a person who intends to be a father, right? Now, eggs and sperms are fertilized, and then the fertilization, after the fertilization, this embryo is placed in a woman's, that is a surrogate mother's uterus. So, this woman is known as the surrogate mother. A surrogate mother is the one who raises a child on the behalf of an intended couple who wants to be parents, right? This is known as surrogacy or a surrogate mother. Now, the rules of 2021, it prohibits commercial surrogacy but allows altruistic surrogacy, which means you can do or you can be a surrogate mother selflessly. Just for the want of money, you cannot be a surrogate mother, which means it has banned commercial surrogacy, and that's the reason people are moving to the abroad countries. The influential people, the ones who have got money, are moving to the abroad countries or developed countries so that they can hire a surrogate mother. Under the Act, the same-sex couples, other members of the LGBTQ community, single men and live-in couples are excluded, which means the same-sex couples, the members of the LGBTQ community cannot be parents, which means they are excluded from the list. Now, what is the eligibility criteria for the intending couple who wants to or who intend to be parents? They should have a certificate of essentiality and certificate of eligibility. What is this certificate? a certificate of proven infertility, which means only when the couple proves that they are not in a position to conceive, or when there's a proven infertility in one or both the parents, only then if a couple is in a position to conceive, then they are not allowed to hire a surrogate mother. Only when the condition arises that of infertility, the intended couple can hire a surrogate mother. What is the requirement for the certificate of eligibility? The Indian citizens and married for at least, a couple should be at least married for 5 years. For a wife, she should be between 23 to 50 years, and for a husband, 26 to 55 years. Again, the intending couple should not have a surviving child. They should not have a child, right? So these are the requirements for the certificate of eligibility. Now, what is the eligibility criteria for the surrogate mother? We discussed the eligibility criteria for the intending couples, but what about the surrogate mother? For example, the one who wants to be a surrogate mother, she should be a close relative to the intending couple, right? Which means they should be one among the relatives. She should be a married woman having her own child. Then she should be between 25 to 35 years, and she can surrogate only once in her lifetime. And again, she has to possess a certificate of medical and psychological fitness. Only then a lady can be a surrogate mother. Now, what are the challenges with the domestic surrogacy laws? Only married couples with specific medical conditions can pursue surrogacy, right? Then use of donor gametes has been restricted or banned in the recent amendments. And the altruistic nature of Indian surrogacy laws has led to tension within families. Why? Because the elders of the families are pressurizing the ladies to be a surrogate mother. Now, the problem is that in India, we do not allow for commercial surrogacy. Why do not allow for commercial surrogacy? Why? Because there are high chances that a woman can be pressurized to be a surrogate mother. Let's say the agents can force a mother to be a surrogate mother so that the agents can earn more and more money. This can lead to exploitation of a woman. That's the reason commercial surrogacy is banned. Or let's say a woman, to earn more money, she can be completely into the cycle, or she can be endlessly into the cycle of being a surrogate mother, which can also impact her life. That's the reason commercial surrogacy is not allowed in our country. At the same time, the medical facilities are not proper in our country, or are not up to the mark. That's the reason the surrogacy or commercial surrogacy has been banned, right? Again, the other challenge being, for example, LGBTQ plus community, they cannot basically hire a surrogate mother. So these are some of the challenges. Now, increasing trend of overseas surrogacy. Now, the privileged Indians, now ones who have got money, as we discussed, they move to the developed countries like, let's say, USA and Canada. At the same time, the East European and the Latin American countries. Now, in this country, it is possible because the laws of those countries allow for commercial surrogacy, and that's the reason the privileged Indians move abroad in order to hire a surrogate mother. Now, students, there are also challenges with respect to hiring a surrogate mother in the US. For example, using a surrogate mother is deemed legal and ethical under the international intellectual property. But there are restrictions on travel for the purpose of giving birth in the US, which means it is not simple to go to the US to hire a surrogate mother to give birth in the US. Why? Because in the US, let's say if a child is born in the US, then the USA government is obliged to provide citizenship to that newly born child. And that's the reason the USA has come up with restrictions, travel restrictions and visa requirement restrictions, so that the USA government is trying to restrict the number of people who intends to come to the US to hire a surrogate mother, right? So what can be the way forward? Way forward, for example, it is very important that the marginalized groups should be included. For example, the LGBTQ plus community, right? Now, as people are not in a position to conceive, so the government has to be empathetic and also include these people, so that these people should also be in a position, could also hire a surrogate person, so that they can also be parents and play the role of being a parent, right? Then transparency and legal support is very, very important, right? So in case the government wishes to allow commercial surrogacy, transparency is very important. The government has to ensure that the women are not exploited. Then regulation of surrogacy agencies. The agencies who are in the business of taking care of these surrogate mothers, or they are in the business of hiring surrogate mothers, they should be careful enough. In the sense, the government should regulate all such surrogacy agencies so that these surrogacy agencies should not exploit the women. Then it is also important to protect these surrogate child rights, right? At the same time, it is very important to have a uniform regulation worldwide so that each and every country should abide by the international regulations, so that there can be a chance to have a uniform regulation applying to different countries. So this is with respect to the surrogacy laws in our country, few challenges associated with it. I hope students you have understood this particular topic. Students, the fifth topic to discuss is the topic Path to Viksit Bharat. Now, the author of this article wants India to focus on per capita GDP rather than focusing on the aggregate GDP. So, what exactly is this? Let's try to understand it. Again, it comes under why it is important for the UPSC examination, because again, Viksit Bharat, per capita income, lower middle income countries, these are the keywords of this particular article. Again, it falls under Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization, resources, growth, development. At the same time, inclusive growth and issues arising from it. So, this topic can be mapped under this article. So, this subtopics of the GS syllabus. Now, what's the question? Define potential GDP and explain its determinants. What are the factors that have been inhibiting or restricting India from realizing its potential GDP? Such type of questions can be asked. Now, what is the context? The context is that with a modest 6% annual GDP growth, India will be the world's third largest economy by 2028. Right? Now, we are the fifth largest economy. By 2028, we are going to be the third largest economy. Now, as India is going to be the third largest economy, and that's the reason the author wants India to focus now more on the per capita GDP, which means if India wants to be categorized under the developed countries list, then the per capita number, the per capita GDP should shoot up to $13,000 to $14,000 if India wants to be a truly developed country. The current per capita GDP of India is around $2,200 to $2,300, right? Now, historical context, in 1990, India's per capita GDP was higher than China's. The overall economy of the China was greater than that of India, but the per capita GDP of India was slightly on the higher side vis-a-vis China. But after 1999, in next 20 years, China catapulted. China rose through the ranks and China became the second largest economy. At the same time, the per capita GDP of China, or the people in China, significantly grew in volume, right? So again, this 20 years has helped China to be ranked or to be considered one among the most developed nations, or for that matter, most influential nations in the geopolitics. Now, the question is, why is it that we have to focus on per capita GDP? Let's try to understand it. Now, it is imperative, it is needful that India should focus on per capita GDP, right? So, per capita GDP is more accurate reflection of the standard of living and the economic development. Why it's important? Let's try to understand. Let's consider the first parameter, that is economic size and influence. Now, the aggregate GDP, just by focusing on the aggregate GDP, it measures the total economic output of a country regardless of size. It doesn't matter what the population size is, it just focuses on the overall GDP number. But per capita, it adjusts the economic output by population size, which means it also looks into the economic development and standard of living of each and every individual. For example, China's large aggregate GDP gives it global influence, right? So, looking at the size of China's GDP, now China's GDP is $19 trillion economy. India's GDP is $3 trillion economy, right? So looking at China's GDP number, it appears that China is the most influential country. But if we have to focus on the per capita GDP growth, then Monaco's high per capita GDP doesn't grant it similar power, right? The overall GDP grants China the power, but it does not grant Monaco the same power, despite Monaco having the high per capita GDP. Next parameter, the second parameter is the developmental insight. Now, the aggregate GDP shows the overall economic power, okay, but not the distribution of wealth. So it shows the overall economic power, but does not show the distribution of wealth. It does not show the inequality existing in a country, right? But per capita, it provides insight into the average citizen's economic condition, reflecting the living standard of people, right? So this is the per capita GDP. Example, India's growing aggregate GDP contrasts with its moderate per capita GDP, which means that though the GDP of India is growing year on year, but somehow the per capita GDP is not increasing in commensuration with the overall GDP, which means the GDP is rising at around 6 to 7% per year, but the per capita GDP is not increasing as it is with the overall GDP number, right? In the international comparison, the aggregate GDP is useful for gauging countries' economic scale and influence in the global market. For example, USA and China, right? So they have influence in the global market. Why? Because their aggregate GDP is much higher. Per capita, it is important or it is better for comparing the standard of living and economic well-being, right? For example, let's say if we take the European countries, right? Now, these European countries are very small in size. But if you look at the per capita GDP, let's say, let's take the Scandinavian countries. Let's take Norway, or let's take any country, right? Though the population is less, though the size is less, but the per capita is much more than the per capita of an Indian. And example, the USA has high aggregate GDP. Nations like Liechtenstein have high per capita GDPs, indicating richer populations, right? The geopolitical heft. Now, the aggregate GDP contributes to countries' influence and bargaining power, right? The more the GDP, more influence a country can put in the geopolitical arena. Per capita, high per capita GDP is less influential geopolitically. It's less influential. Now, USA and China have significant geopolitical power. Why? Because their aggregate GDP is much higher, right? But if we talk at Bermuda, now Bermuda's overall GDP is not higher, but the per capita is much more higher. That's the reason Bermuda influence is much less than what the influence is for the US and China. Reflects standard of living. Now, the aggregate GDP does not reflect the standard of living of people. It focuses overall on the wealth of the country, but the per capita GDP reflects on the economic well-being and the standard of living of every individual. Now, talking about India, India's overall GDP is higher, but per capita GDP is less. So these are some of the indicators, and these indicators will help you to understand the importance of per capita GDP. For example, you must have come across politicians talking that India will be a $5 trillion economy, $10 trillion economy, but the focus has to be on per capita GDP, because what we have to ensure is that when our country is growing, we also need to ensure that each and every person, or the living standard of each and every person, is improving, right? So, the way forward, even with the modest growth rates, India is on the track to become the world's third largest economy by 2028, but the focus has to be more on the per capita GDP. I hope students have understood the fifth topic, right? Now, students, it's time to discuss some practice questions. So let's get started. The question number 1. The question is, which of the following entity calculates GDP in India? We discussed about the aggregate GDP and the per capita GDP. So, students, in India, it is the Central Statistics Office that calculates the GDP in our country. So answer is B. Next question. Consider the following statements. India, with a size of USD 3.7 trillion, is currently the fifth largest economy in the world after the US, China, Japan and Germany. Yes. So except India, all other four countries come under the category of developed economies because their per capita GDP, no. China is yet to fall under the bracket of developed economies. So China does not fall under the developed economies. So statement second is incorrect. The first statement is correct. So it has to be option A. Next questions will consider the following statements about VVPAT, that is voter verifiable paper audit trail. Currently, the counting of votes via VVPAT slips is conducted across all polling stations in India. No, it is conducted only in 5 polling stations in every constituency. Now, in the Subramaniam Swamy versus ECI 2013 case, VVPAT is indispensable for free. Yes, the Supreme Court held that VVPAT is important for holding free and fair elections. So, option B has to be correct answer for question number 3. Which is the primary legal basis of Kerala's challenge regarding borrowing limits imposed by the Union government? Again, it's Article 293. We just discussed that. Article 293 allows the state governments to borrow funds from the central government. Now, next question. Which of the following is not an eligibility criteria for a surrogate mother under the Surrogacy Regulation Act 2021? So, being a close relative of the intending couple, it is a eligibility criteria. Being a married woman without a child, no, we just discussed that being a married with a child is an eligibility criteria. Without a child, no, this is incorrect. So, it is not an eligibility criteria. Option B has to be the correct answer for question number 5. What are the causes for urban poverty in India? Discuss the measures that can be taken, right? Now, students, with such type of questions, you have to start your introduction by defining or by explaining the meaning of poverty. So, what is poverty? Poverty essentially means that the income that one generates is not sufficient to meet the basic necessities of life. And then you can also mention the data from the Indian employment rate, highlighting how poverty is a serious issue in our country. Then body, again, you need to mention the causes. We already have discussed the causes. So, which are the causes? For example, we have indebtedness as one factor. Then migration is another factor, isn't it? Migration is another factor. Then lack of skills. Lack of skills is another factor. Then we have crowding. So, these are some of the reasons or some of the causes for urban poverty in our country. And what can be the solution? For example, solution, we discussed that the government should focus on providing social security benefits to the people or to the urban poor. Then we have to ensure that the urban poor should have access to health, sanitation and healthcare. In the social sector, we have decided that, or we discussed that how a Manrega scheme can be implemented in the urban centers as well, right? Then we can also have migration centers. These centers would enable or would facilitate seamless migration from rural to urban centers, right? And then we can also mention the establishment of self-help group, which can enable an environment wherein business activities can be started among the urban poor, right? And then in the last, you can also mention some of the schemes undertaken by the government of India. For example, we have the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, then we have the Antyodaya Yojana, then we have the Ayushman Bharat. So, these are some of the schemes that the government of India has introduced in order to alleviate urban poverty. So, this is how you have to frame the means answer. So, students, this is all about our discussion on the daily news analysis of the 5 topics that we have discussed in today's lecture. So, students, I hope you all loved listening to the lecture, and I'm pretty sure that being consistent with listening the daily news analysis is going to benefit immensely in your exam preparation. So friends, for more such interesting videos, please like, share and subscribe to Narayana IAS. Thank you.